Hey, Jimbo, you ready for this deal?
Turn him out.
Old stories like long lost friends, rodeos and late night bends, history before our time, round pens and pasture rides, cowboys of the Osage.
Howdy, friends and neighbors. Time once again for the Cowboys of the Osage podcast with your host, Jimbo Snively and Cody Garnett. Now let's sing a little bit about it. Cowboys of the Osage, riding once again. Always got some time for a friend. And here they are, the Cowboys of the Osage.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Cowboys of the Osage podcast, brought to you by the Ben Johnson Cowboy Museum, the Buck and Flamingo Turquoise Shop, and now Saucy Calf, traditional Native American food, all located in historic downtown Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Hey, it's old Cody over here, and as always, I have my main man with me, Mr. Rodeo Historian himself, Jimbo Snively. Good morning, Jimbo. Who do we have today?
Hey, Cody boy, it's another great day in Osage, man. And Cody, we've got one of the top announcers in the history of rodeo and steer roping. In fact, he's been called the voice of steer roping. And he announced the first ever circuit finals. He's announced the college finals, the high school finals, the Indian finals. He was on the NFR broadcast team in 1986. Had a 47-year career as an announcer, rodeo announcer. He's in the South Dakota Sports Hall of Fame. He's fixing to go in the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame. He's in the Casey Tibbs South Dakota Hall of Fame, Cowboy Hall of Fame. Of course, I'm talking about Jim Thompson, one of the great voices in the history of rodeo. And he's coming to us today from South Dakota, I guess, right? Yeah. And
yeah, Jimbo, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Welcome to the Cowboys of the Osage podcast, Jim.
Well, listen, Pawhuska is a great place, and my wife and I have been there often. Rod Hartness has been a great friend of mine for many, many years, and of course Cody has been that way too, and his dad. And so every time we get to Pawhuska, we make a point of going down to the turquoise shop or to the museum, and it's an amazing place. So I'm glad just to be part of the Osage.
Well, now he's got a place for you to eat too when you come. It's Saucy Calf. He's got a cafe here now. Well, it's good. But anyway, man, where'd you grow up at, Jim?
I grew up in Oregon, actually. I was born in North Dakota, but my dad was a rancher and was a well-respected cattleman. And so people knew about him often, and he was into Hereford cattle. So there was a point when somebody called him from Oregon and asked if he would come out. He was going to turn his wheat ranch, a wheat farm, into a cattle ranch, and or at it. And Dad moved out there with me and my mom and my brother, and then I had two other brothers that were born there. One of them is Rick Thompson, who's the head of the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame, as a matter of fact. And so, yeah, we've had a good experience in rodeo.
Did you work any events as a young man?
I never did. I was the oldest, so when I got old enough, I got into radio, and that was kind of without a huge story with that. I happened to have a broadcaster friend who called on the place that I worked when I was in high school, on a grocery store where I worked in the meat market. And one day he said to me, "You ought to get into radio." So he helped me apply to a Minneapolis broadcast school, and I went there and then got into radio, and I worked in radio most of my life. But as a result, rodeo was kind of on the back burner until Jim Sutton asked me one time about announcing. And of course, the Corcos were in that same part of South Dakota, and so I worked rodeos for both of them, just kind of helping until one day they said, you ought to get your card. You got to go see if you can do these rodeos. So that's what I did. And so Clem McSpadden was one of the guys that helped me, Jerry Olson. And I was able to get a PRCA card, announced the very first circuit finals that was in the Badlands circuit. That was the first year that they ever did circuit finals. And honestly, Jimbo, I have to tell you, I was so green. I didn't even know what I didn't know.
Right.
But it was still interesting. And I, of course, rodeo circuit finals at that point were not necessarily well received. It was hard. I think there were more people behind the chutes than in the stands in Deadwood, and it was raining, but I got to do it. By golly, it was a wonderful experience. But steer roping is the one that, and now you probably get to this later. I don't mean to get out of this, but Jack Hunter was an announcer and sound man in South Dakota, and he got me involved at the Wyoming State Fair in Douglas. And I had never really seen steer roping. I knew about it. My dad's, I always had the sports news or the rodeo sports news annual or something, and I was able to see all the steer ropers, but I didn't really know anything about it. But they had that at the Wyoming State Fair, and what an experience for me. Bobby Harris's mother was one of the timers, and she was a corker. I enjoyed working with her, but I learned a lot about steer roping, and that's when I finally decided that at some point when I was ready to make the decision, I was going to get out of rodeo and only announce steer roping. And I did that kind of concurrent with when Deadwood added steer roping, and I said, steer roping's enough for me. I'm not interested in any more bull riding or bronc riding. I'll be fine with steer roping, and that's been the case ever since.
He was sitting beside a real expert in steer roping with old Janie. Was that her name? Bobby's mom?
Yeah, Janie.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Did you know her?
Oh yeah. Every steer roper knew her, Jim.
I remember her.
Every steer roper. She was an expert in steer roping and all forms of roping. She was also a Calcutta expert. So.
Yes, I learned a lot from Janie Harris. In fact, when I did the Deke Latham rodeo, they needed a way to add some money to us for a scholarship. So, using what I learned from Janie Harris, I started a Calcutta at that Deke Latham rodeo, which I announced, and we gave half of it as a scholarship. And part of the reason, then when I got the Resistol Committee Man of the Year award one year in Las Vegas, and that was because of that Calcutta and the way the rodeo there in KC.
Yeah, Jimbo, they have the Deke Latham Memorial. I guess Deke was quite the bronc rider. I didn't really ever get a chance to see him, but my dad won KC one year in the steer open, and they gave all the winners of KC an elk tooth, a whistler tooth is what they call it. It's like a little hat pin deal they made. I think that was their traditional price.
I have one of those. That's something that I've always respected. But that's where I really started to learn more about steer roping. Like I said, I started there in Douglas, and just a quick story. I don't know how much time we have.
Lots of time.
Let me just throw this in because I think this was important. The guys from Wyoming were entered big, but there were lots of other ropers. And so the guys from Wyoming are starting out the top of the list, and there's 15s and 13s and 12s and an 11. And then Glenn Barlow, who was always kind of the king of the steer ropers up in our part of the world. He's from Gillette, Wyoming. Glenn came out and had a 10-5, and I thought, my gosh, this is the class. There'll never be another run. Well, then all the guys from Oklahoma and down south came in, but one of them was Guy Allen. Now, I'd read about Guy Allen, of course, but never seen him. And Guy comes out and ropes one an 8-5. I mean, now, for a young man who's starting to really get taken with this steer roping, to see a 10-5 from one of my Wyoming heroes, and then here's Guy, and he's amazing. I mean, he was riding that, what was the name of that good gray horse that he had for so many years? He won most of his titles on him. But he was that was where I learned about horses and watching horses. And I'd often, as an announcer, I would say, I know it's tough not to watch the roper, but watch the horse. That's the one that really typifies the champions. If this horse knows is a part of the partnership. And if he keeps that rope tight, that helps that roper win. And that was what I saw with Guy. It was amazing.
Yeah, he did that pretty regular everywhere we went, Jim.
Yeah.
You know, there's another famous cowboy from up there at Casey, Wyoming, too, old Chris Ledoux.
Oh, Chris. I got to know Chris pretty well as a result. It wasn't his rodeo. He lived there, but I learned to really respect Chris. I, of course, knew him. I had all of his, at those days, I didn't have any of the records, but I did have cassettes, and his father-in-law ran a store there, and anytime I was out of cassettes, he'd come by and say, "Jim, you need any of Chris's tapes?" And I said, "Sure." And he'd bring the latest ones to me. And then Chris would show up as much as he could at that Deke Latham roping, and he was always there to help, pull gates, or he brought me a tape one time, came stomping up the stairs. I'll never forget, I had an old Chris Ledoux CD or cassette on, and he comes stomping up the steps, bursts in the studio, into the control room there, and said, "Jim, is that the newest one of my tapes? You got to have a new tape." And he takes the tape out of my tape player and puts this new one in. But Chris was a good man. There were times I'd do an interview with him. He'd be home on a Sunday after having played somewhere on a Saturday night. And one time I went out to his place just a little bit north of KC, and he was in the field. And I'm not sure what he was. He had a irrigation system working up there. He's got a suit coat, and he's wearing a yellow duster and boots. He's got his hip boots pulled clear up over his pant legs, and he's out there. Even though he was still dressed for going on stage, he was out working in that irrigation. And an amazing man. I really admired him.
You know what else they have there, best of my memory, Jimbo? I got some limited memories of KC, Wyoming. I think they got this big, long set of buildings there, and it's like two bars. One bar is a biker bar. One bar is a cowboy bar, and there's a door in the middle that goes in between the two bars. So I think it gets a little wild around there sometimes.
I always said it became the third largest city in Wyoming on the night of the Deke Latham, because people came from all over the country. It was a big deal, and good rodeo. Bronc riders, because of Deke's bronc riding, and I got to meet Deke when he first started, and his brother Craig and his mom, was a great friend over time, and having Deke die like he did after that in December of right after the national finals, and he'd done really well at his very first national finals. Came home. There wasn't any TV in those days, but there was a tape somehow of the finals, and somebody sent it to him, and he went to the post office to pick it up, and on the way back to show it to his mother, and I don't know if it was ice or snow or whatever, he tipped his pickup over and killed himself, and it was a terrible loss. And KC still has a little trouble with that because he was a young man, looked like he was on his way to real stardom and heroics, and died that early.
They also got a steer roper that hails from there right now too, Jimbo. Rio Losi made the national finals last year. Well on his way to making his second national finals this year. So that's a cowboy town.
A good man. Yeah, his dad and Rio provided the steers in the Wyoming circuit for the longest time, the Mountain State Circuit steer ropers, and for all of the guys that roped to Bighorn for the Don King days, they had the steers. And Mike helped. In fact, one time I'll never forget, Rio as a rookie had won a few ropings or won a few dollars anyway. And I made a comment to Mike. I said, "Boy, Rio's doing pretty well." He said, "Well, my checkbook says it isn't so good."
You mentioned
Rio.
Go ahead.
Rio stayed with it. I like the fact that he stayed with it, and he's a good roper and a nice young man.
You mentioned Clem McSpadden a while ago. What made Clem so special as an announcer, Jim? And did you take anything from his style or how he did it?
Clem McSpadden, you're talking?
Yeah, yes.
Clem McSpadden, I thought of him, knew of him as an announcer long before I met him.
Mm-hmm.
But then I got to meet him when he was announcing the national final to rodeo and producing the NFR when it was in Oklahoma City. And then I met, so I learned where I could call him. And then when I served for a while in the South Dakota State Senate, and whenever we had ag issues, I would call Clem, and he always took my call. He always answered, had questions for me and answers for me, and I really admired him. And then when after his death, his wife sent me a copy of the book that he wrote and autographed it for me, and I was really humbled with that. That Clem was a gentleman, absolute one of the finest men I ever met.
Right.
You know, Jimbo and Jim, we do carry that book right here in the museum. If anybody wants to buy it, we bought all of Clem's back stock of all of the books from his personal stash that he had at his house in his auction after his death. So we have probably more copies for sale of Clem's book than anybody right now.
You've got a lot of stuff. I was meant to ask you about that. I have collected over my career every one of the media guides that have been put out for announcers, and every one of the sports news. In fact, I've got all the old sports news annuals and a lot of the NFR annuals. And I wondered, not everybody cares about those, and I wondered if you would never need those down at the museum.
I would love those media guides. They used to be, so when you used to make the national finals, my dad, when he used to make the finals, they'd actually send us a media guide in the mail, the same one that everybody else got. And
Sure.
And those older ones, they have so much more information in them than the newer ones, for sure. They got the world champions going all the way back to the beginnings of rodeos in those older media guides. And, there's a lot of, and, a lot of the guys that were in the top 30, they had a little bio and stuff from them.
Sure.
There's stuff that's hard to find nowadays. So, yeah, if you ever decide to get rid of those, we would be a prime candidate to send them to, Jim, especially on the media guides.
When I come to Pawhuska again, I'll bring those to you because they're better off at the museum than they are on my shelves. Because the problem is I'm disappointed when I find cowboys that aren't interested in those old books because lots of information, just amazing information. So I'll do that.
I always would read about all the old world champion steer ropers in those. And there was a guy, he always made me laugh, just the name of him, Jimbo. Red Booger was his name. And he was out from, I think, Buffalo, Oklahoma or something. But I don't know why it always tickled my fancy. Still does to this day. Because obviously I'm thinking about a different kind of booger. But you ever heard of Red Booger, steer roper?
I haven't. No, that's interesting.
Maybe it was Booger Red. I'm not sure.
I think he was in one of Willard Porter's books.
But anyway, that name always cracked me.
Sounds like the name of a bull.
Yeah. Did you ever know Eddie Hanna, or was he much older than you before your time?
Give me that name again.
Eddie Hanna.
Oh, Eddie Hanna is, unfortunately, I don't think I ever did meet him. No, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he was a real popular announcer up in that country back in the 50s and into the 60s. He announced Cheyenne and different places, but he was really big into the jackpot steer ropings and stuff, and announced Laramie and stuff, and he was a real popular announcer back then. I just didn't know if you'd ever got to cross paths with him or not.
Here's an interesting story that maybe you would have remembered this guy. I was on a cruise one time, a European cruise, and it was on all the rivers of the Rhine and the Rhone and the Danube, and it was kind of a fun thing for me. But one night at dinner, I had sat with a different group of people because I wanted to meet folks that I hadn't met before. So at this table was a guy from Denver, and he said, I have a relative that was a rodeo champion. And you hear that all the time, and they may have won their county fair or something, and that's all anybody knows. So I said, I was a little skeptical, but I said, well, who was it? And he said, it's Charles Maggini. And I said, really, where was he from? California. I said, well, what was his event? Because I never heard of the man. Well, he was a cattle roper. I said, well, like a calf roper? No, he roped, and he was trying to think of the word. And I said, it wasn't a steer roper, was he? A single steer roper? Yeah, I think that's what it was. I said, well, did you know him? He said, no, this was back in the 20s. So I excused myself from the table. Now, this is on a cruise liner, a smaller boat, but on the rivers in Europe. And I go back to the cabin, and I get a computer out, and I look up the PRCA website. It takes me a while to get everything done, but the guy's name was Charles Magini from San Jose. He was the first ever PRCA or RCA steer roping champion, and from 1929. And I thought of how amazing that they'd bring that up at the table, and absolutely a place that I never would have anticipated. And I followed up a little bit with him, and I really never did find anybody that knew him. But I mean, from 1929, you'd have to be around.
Yeah, I've heard the name. I knew he was a champion. Yeah, he was from out there in California for sure. World champion.
And I don't know how much they would have won. It might have been $1,500 in those days, or they may have won like they used to do like the bronc riding. Casey Tibbs, his early championships came because he won Pendleton, or he was the winner at Cheyenne back before the RCA put together a finals and all of that. The winners sometimes were just from whoever won a given rodeo.
Right. You got to know Casey there later in his life, didn't you?
Casey was one of my heroes. Of course, being from even though I grew up in Oregon, South Dakota was where I was born, and I was in North Dakota actually, but in the Dakotas. And Casey you got to admire him. So one day he came to Deadwood to the days of '76, and I got to meet him. And then later, when he'd been out in Ramona, California, I got a phone call a phone call that said, I'm looking for the announcer, Jim Thompson. And I thought I recognized the voice. And I said, who's calling? And he said, Casey Tibbs. And I said, oh my gosh, Casey, yes, this is Jim. And he said, well, I'd like you to do a rodeo. See if you're free to do a rodeo. And I said, Casey, if I'm not, I will be. If you want me to come to California and do a rodeo for you, I will cancel something, which I had to, as it turned out. But it was still, I did that for 3 or 4 years till he died. And then I came the year after, kind of in his memory, we put together that last one in Ramona, California. Now, they didn't do tripping, but it was a good rodeo.
I talked to a friend of mine last night. I think you know him, Doc Ford from Lemon.
Yes, of course, sure.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I was talking to him last night, and he said at one time there was a cafe or restaurant there in, I think, Pierre, where they had all his saddles up there on the top. Whatever happened to them? He said they weren't there anymore.
No, that was, oh my gosh, it'll come to me here in a minute. Right in the heart of it, you're going down, not downtown Pierre, but on the main drag as it comes through from the north and drives through Pierre. And that cafe had all of Casey's saddles. It was saddles and buckles and hats and trophies of all kinds and pictures. I did my let's see, what did I call that? Coach's Corner every Saturday morning at that restaurant. And Casey, I didn't really know him then, but I knew about all of this stuff. So you get a lot of history from that. And one day I was getting ready to do my show, and I heard some angry voices from the kitchen. And so I kind of followed the track back to see, because I needed to check in with the cook, make sure that everybody knew I was there. And here was Casey Tibbs, and he was almost crying because they had sold some of his saddles. And he said, "Those are my saddles. And what right do you have?" And there was a new owner, and the man said, "Well, we bought everything, including those saddles. We've been paying the insurance on them. So all of that stuff belongs to us." And what Casey was doing, South Dakota had started a Hall of Fame there in Fort Pierre, and he wanted to take some of those saddles to the Hall of Fame. And he thought that they were just watching them for him, but he just hadn't come back. And the guy that now owned it, and it had probably been through 3 different owners, and the this guy didn't have any idea who Casey Tibbs was, but all that stuff, he owned it. He was going to take care of it. Now, eventually, Casey was able to get a lot of it transferred, but I'll never forget that day. He was my hero, and he's practically in tears because he was looking to all the stuff that he'd won over his career, and now it didn't own it. They said he didn't own it anymore.
Wow.
Sad.
Yeah, it really is. What kind of guy was Casey?
Well, of course, I knew him. I knew Casey as an older man.
Right,
he,
sure.
Of course, wasn't
you missed out on the wilder days.
Oh, they tell me that the people that knew him said that he wasn't really mean. Mean was the wrong word, but he took pranks to the nth degree.
Right.
And there's lots of things about Casey, that he thought they were funny, but then people in those days, they didn't have the organization necessarily. They didn't have college rodeo. Casey was riding before he was, I don't even know if he went to high school. He won the White River Rodeo when he was just a kid, and he won Cheyenne as just a kid. I mean, it just amazes me. But he grew up in a rodeo family and on a ranch, and really in the backwoods. So he was pretty. Now, when I knew him, he was a gentleman. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I went to Ramona, was doing a column for the local ag paper in South Dakota, and so I put it in my column. I said I got a chance to go out and do this rodeo with Casey Tibbs. I said, if anybody has any questions, let me know, and I'll ask him when I do the interview. So I got lots of questions, but the one that was most asked was, is Casey still drinking? Because he'd had a real alcohol problem. Mm-hmm. So when I got to Ramona, of course, I'm not going to ask my hero that question, but when I got out there, I was around him as much as I could be. And when he got done with the rodeo on a Sunday afternoon, he said, Jim, I got to run out and take these horses back to the pasture. Would you like to ride along with me? And then we can go get a drink. Well, I perked up. Then I can ask that question. I'll see what he does. So we go out to this place where he dumped the horses out of the trailer. And there was an old fishing boat there, and it tipped over on the side of the lake. And we sat on that fishing boat, and I interviewed him. I just turned the mic on and just asked him questions. And what a great time. I mean, I asked him about just brought names up about cowboys and what did he think about them? Like the Lindermans. I said, Casey, what about the Lindermans from Montana? What kind of guys were there? He said, Jim, hell, they'd have been in prison if they weren't cowboys. Casey was quite the Casey, but later when we got done, we got in the pickup and he said, well, let's go to what kind of a bar would you like? No, he didn't say bar, but he said, where would you like to go to get a drink? And I said, it's your town. I'll go wherever you want to go. So we pulled up to a place that a bar and grill. And I thought, okay, well, now I'll see if Casey's still drinking. So I get out of the pickup. We walk inside. The bartender looks at us, speaks to Casey like he knows him. And Casey said, Jim, what are you drinking? I said, whatever you're having. And he turns to the bartender and says, 2 Diet Cokes, please. And Casey did. I found out later. Casey, when he got to Ramona, he was still drinking. And one day he was passed out, as he told me, literally in the gutter in downtown Ramona. It's kind of a small town. And some guy came and picked him up that he didn't even know. He didn't know anything about rodeo, but he knew that Casey had become kind of a clown to people in Ramona. This guy took him to an AA meeting, and he committed to being with him until he quit drinking. And Casey did. That's what he did. He went to AA with this guy till the end of his life. And I really admired Casey because he recognized his weaknesses, and he became what could have been just a class clown in Ramona to being a real class act, and people really admired him. He was they put the rodeo on and put his name on it, and they were all proud of that.
Right. That's a good story. Good for him.
Yes, good for him.
As they should be.
Right.
Proud to have. How big a star was that guy? How big a star would he have been today? I mean, People all over the world knew his name.
Yeah.
I was just listening to a sports channel, and they were talking about Bill Walton, who just died recently, and he could have been one of the best ever if he hadn't been hurt. And how about Mickey Mantle if he hadn't been hurt? And how about this guy and that guy? And I got to thinking, what about Casey Tibbs? You know, Casey was never really hurt, but he really didn't have, when he started rodeoing, they didn't really have standings as such. They really took whatever money he could win and move to the next place. And he was on the cover of Life magazine. Amazing. Like you said, all over the world, he was like Buffalo Bill. I mean, he was bigger than life.
I'm going to say he's more mainstream than any cowboy before or since. You know.
Yeah, probably. The guys are getting more so with college, Jimbo, don't you think?
Yeah, probably.
College
and the Cowboy Channel and just all that, you know, they're getting more mainstream. But Casey was he was a rock star, you know, in his prime.
Before we even knew what mainstream was, people knew Casey Tibbs.
Right.
He was handsome, you know, and he dressed. I mean, I don't know, all those purple things, you know. But he was a cowboy, and there's no question. You put him horseback with cattle, and he knew what to do. He grew up on a ranch, and so his life was cowboying, and rodeo just fit him, and he was amazing.
How many different radio shows and columns have you done, Jim?
Well, I've been in radio since 1970, I guess. I got out of the Army, went to Korea in 1968, and I had been in radio then, but it was just kind of started, and then the Vietnam War was underway, and so I volunteered for the draft, and I ended up in Denver first as a military policeman. You can understand how the Army works. So I'm an MP in Denver at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and then when they transferred us overseas, my sergeant, there were 26 of us, and everybody got orders for Vietnam. And when he handed out the paperwork, we were all in the meeting room, and he said, "Everybody leave, Thompson, you stay." So I hung behind, not knowing what that was about. And he said, "I can't do this for everybody," but he said, "I'm going to send you to Korea instead. I can send one guy to Korea." So I ended up in Korea rather than Vietnam, and that was, of course, at the height of the Vietnam War. I would read the Stars and Stripes every day, and when I was in Incheon or Seoul, and I'd see the guys that had been with me that died in Vietnam. It was a very emotional time. So when I got back in 1970, I went back into radio, and I started as an announcer, and then moved into sales, and then sales management, and then manager. Owned a radio station for a time, and then when I left radio as an organization, then I put on. I had my own talk show, and I had a studio that I produced it like you guys are doing a little bit, except I didn't know anything about blogs or things like that at that point. All I knew was I found radio stations to carry my program, and I was very successful. In fact, when you first met me, Cody, that's what I would have been doing. And so I had a live talk show for 2 hours every day, Monday through Friday, for many years across 5 states, and sold the advertising. And so that really, it was a good thing for me. I really enjoyed that. And of course, knowing rodeo and loving rodeo, and then when I got into steer roping, it gave me an opportunity to be able to sell the idea to people, have them understand what steer roping was about. I don't know if you've met my wife, Sherry she grew up on a ranch, but she didn't know anything about steer roping. So she went with me to Deadwood the first time, and I'll never forget the first guy. I think Jim Davis was the first roper, and Jim got one roped and had that steer laid out, and the Rapid City Journal took a picture of that steer laid. It looked about 6 feet off the ground, and of course that drew a lot of animal rights protests. So I made it my life then to both teach my wife and that audience what steer roping was about. And Cody, you've heard me say there was a point when, like in Cheyenne, they often said there's only 7 states where steer roping is legal. Well, when I got in the South Dakota State Senate, I started checking up on that. And I checked one of the guys that worked with me from the Legislative Research Council. I put him on that, and I said, was it ever illegal in South Dakota? So he found out that it wasn't, but then because I'd asked, he started looking, and he said, there is nowhere in the United States that steer roping has ever been illegal. And now later, I think it was one of the guys from Wyoming gave me a book called Rodeo Park or something, talking about there was a point when either Texas and New Mexico had the ranchers had made it illegal because they got tired of these cowboys roping their steers out in the pasture. So they made it illegal for the cowboys, but it wasn't illegal for the state. So there's never been a place where it's been illegal. And that's the only thing with that is I've brought that up a few times, and some guys that come up to me and says, don't say that. Somebody will find out about it and try to make it illegal.
Yeah, I'd always heard Rhode Island was the one state that, but I don't think they can even flank a bull or rope a calf or anything in that state.
There was one time that it was in Texas, or
Yeah, that's that Cowboy Park. Right. They were they were having all the steer roping contests down there south of the border in Juarez, I believe, on a place where they would have horse races and stuff, but they were also having steer roping matches down there across the border. That's where you had to go. You had to run across the border.
Those old Western movies, they show those guys. I think Tommy Lee Jones and some of those guys at an old Western movie I saw one time were roping steers. That was part of the movie.
That's the Good Old Boys, and then that was actually the steer roping, the roping fiesta at San Angelo. It was depicted in one of the first ones there. They team roped remember they roped a car. Tommy Lee Jones and his buddy. Yeah, Ole Smith. Ole Smith was the roper in that.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. The Good Old Boys with Tommy Lee Jones. So I think, don't quote me on this, Jim, but I'm pretty sure they were trying to depict the San Angelo roping fiesta, one of the first ones.
Yeah. Well, there are some animal rights people that will look at steer roping and not understand what's happening. But for people who understand cattle and horses and steers, not everybody has the luxury of having two team ropers out there to stop a steer. And so you got one roper, and you had to learn a way to catch him and get him on the ground and doctor him or do whatever needed to be done. And so that today has become single steer roping. And of course, in the day when I first started, and I've had to learn this, who's your the announcer down there? As I get older, I forget this.
Charlie?
Who announces this? Charlie Throckmorton. I admire Charlie. Somebody came up to the announcer stand in Deadwood one time and said, "You're the voice of steer roping." And I said, I'd like to have you say that. Thank you very much. That's a nice honor. But I got to tell you, Charlie Throckmorton, he's the guy that I want to listen to. I've always enjoyed Charlie. Never got a chance to work with him, but I've got to listen to him. And he and I have talked regularly, but I got off the subject. I'm not sure where we were headed with that, but
well, the voice of steer roping, you're the northern voice of steer roping up in the Dakotas and Wyoming. I'd say Kurt Robinson is the voice of steer roping up in the Oregons, and most of the big jackpot ropings, Kurt Robinson has done. Voice of steer roping, Clem McSpadden and Charlie Throckmorton. Those are the four voices of steer roping, in my opinion.
No question about Clem, of course, but I know that it's just fun to be included in that group because, to my way of thinking, it's really great. Now, I announced my last steer roping during the Don King days. It was the 30th year that I'd done that, and I said, there's guys waiting out there that love to do this and need a chance to be here. If I stay here, I'll be here forever, and so I'm going to retire. So I did. But I'd done Deadwood for many, 50, I guess probably parts of 50 years. I helped with Ralph Tatum. We're the reason steer roping is held in Deadwood. Ralph and I put on a roping in Buffalo, South Dakota, a steer roping. There have been some other steer ropings, but we helped get it into the circuit and make it a circuit finals. And so I'm really proud of that. I've had a chance to be a part of steer roping and get it to where people could understand what it was about, why we did it. And it's like the saddle bronc riding or the calf roping. I mean, you're doing those because those are ranch events. Those are things that had to be done. Now, something like steer wrestling or bull riding, all that, of course, was added for rodeo's sake. But rodeo essentially is ranch roping and ranch riding and all of that. And that's, people understand that better when you explain to them. It all started in the West.
Where do you see steer roping heading, Jim? The future?
Well, I'm very, if I would be a little more positive about steer roping. I think that the PRCA hasn't done us any favors. I've often thought, well, Rod and I at one point had put together a 26 stop tour that would be steer roping, where the trippers wouldn't have to pay a fee for the cattle, no cattle charge. And we used it around Indian casinos, because the casinos really understand the value, and it isn't the fans necessarily, it's the ropers. Charlie Colomb ran a casino, Indian casino in the south central part of South Dakota. And he told me one time there'd been a rain that had kept crowds away, and they put it on because he was interested in doing the steer roping. And he told me they had the biggest money drop in their history with those steer ropers, because they knew how to gamble when it was all done. I mean, they were in this casino, we're not talking about tearing anything up. They were they knew about poker, and they were gamblers. And he said they did so well that he said, you should just do a whole series of steer roping. And so, Jimbo, what you're saying, I would think that the PRCA needs to give more respect to the steer ropers. We tried at one point, and Cody, you may know this, with Rod Hartness. He had worked a contract with Las Vegas to be able to have the steer roping finals in Las Vegas, and the PRCA kind of turned that around. They kind of like to have it somewhere else, and so the PRCA has not done us any favors. And I think we should just get our own organization and go out and make money for people. You know, Deadwood had never been the rodeo of the year till we added steer roping. And now it's 19 times as the PRCA rodeo of the year. As a matter of fact, it's the only rodeo that's won the small rodeo, the mid-size rodeo, and the large rodeo of the year awards from the PRCA. And that started with steer roping. Deadwood was kind of ready to close, as a matter of fact. They weren't doing well against Cheyenne. It was always about the same time as Cheyenne. And then we put steer roping in, and now Deadwood is bigger than life. I mean, it's become that. And Belfouche started steer roping it for the same reason. When they saw what it did for Deadwood, Belfouche added steer roping.
Do they still have steer roping up at Belfouche?
They still do.
Nice.
As a matter of fact, I retired at the end of 2022. I retired, and but this morning the new director from Belfouche from the Black Hills Roundup called me while I was golfing and said, Would you mind coming back and doing the steer roping for us at Belfouche this year? And I said, let me call you back. I've kind of been turning everything down, but maybe that'd be fun to do, to go back and see all my friends, because most of these guys I still know.
Jimbo, you got to get up there to Deadwood and Belfouche. Just the rodeo grounds there, they've just kept them so historically original and so just really old school on both of the rodeo grounds, best I remember.
Yeah, they've done some upgrading, but Deadwood, it's amazing, and Belfouche too. They've increased the size for the audience. Of course, it's the 4th of July for Belfouche, but Deadwood's used to be the same time as when Wild Bill was shot in Deadwood back in 1876. But they moved it back to the end of July into the first part of August, because they were having trouble with the scheduling around Cheyenne. So that was great for the Cowboys, because it just gives them a chance to rodeo in Deadwood and then just ease on down the road to Cheyenne.
Yeah, I made many trips back and forth from Deadwood to Cheyenne, Jimbo.
Yeah.
Hauling cattle back and forth. One time, Deadwood actually, I don't remember who was supposed to have the cattle there. Well, come to find out they didn't have any cattle and they couldn't do Deadwood, so we had to take the extra steers that we had already used at Cheyenne and roll them over to Deadwood real quick. Just just like a spur of the moment deal.
Yeah. The first year that we did Deadwood, I went to the committee because they said, we've got to do something. Deadwood is dying. The days of 76 is dying. And so I wasn't on the committee, but I'd been the announcer for a long time. And so they said, what would you do, Jim? And I said, well, why don't you throw in the steer roping? The steer ropers are, they'll come and you get 80 or 75 or 80 guys. That'll add to the mix, and that'll get some people. So they agreed, but they said, how much would you have to add? Well, that year was the events at Deadwood were $5,000 added. And so I said, I'll tell you what, if you'll do the steer roping, Ralph Tatum and I will put up the $5,000. And if you like it, when we get done with it, if you like it, then you give us the $5,000 back. And if you don't, then it's ours. Well, before the rodeo was over, before that steer roping was done, the chairman had come up with a $5,000 check. He said, we want this. And part of the reason was, and Cody, you would know this stuff, the committee had so much trouble with cowboys and cowboys' wives. They wanted places to park, and they weren't happy because they didn't get a chance to sit in the shade. And so there was lots of complaining, lots of things about how come I don't have room for my horse and all that stuff. The steer ropers, instead, when they saw somebody from the committee, practically hugged them. Thank you for putting the steer roping in. We love Deadwood. And they said they've never had committee men so happy about adding an event as they did with the steer roping. And so steer roping has been a hero for Deadwood all this time. And as I said, 19 times the rodeo of the year, never once before the tripping, and 19 times since we started.
It's a great rodeo, Jimbo. And that first year they had it up there, there's a girl from right here in Pawhuska. She won $500,000 on a slot machine up there, too.
Yeah, I remember that.
Oh, yeah. Another quick story on that one, Cody, and this really made me feel good because the newspaper, whenever they had the quarter mania, they called it, and it was like 500,000 or a quarter, maybe it was $250,000, but
she won $500,000.
Yeah, really, okay, half a mil. So she put the money in and she won. Well, so the reporter comes out to interview her, gets a picture, and he sees the guys all around her wearing hats, and he said, "So you're here for the rodeo?" And here was her quote: "Nope, we're here for Jim Thompson's steer roping." If that doesn't make your heart smile,
yeah.
Yeah, Jim has done so much up in that country, to grow steer roping. Right. He put on a whole little series up there one time where where they put they give a bronze away to, I think, the top money winner of the series, and they were all rodeos that we'd never really had before as a steer roper, and they were all up in that country. I don't remember all of them, but I went on that run a couple of times, and that was all thanks to Jim. And it was great. It was great to be at places we'd never been before, especially some of these old historic rodeo grounds.
You bet. Well, I appreciate that. I've really learned to appreciate you, Cody, because you understood what I was trying to do, and so when I wasn't sure anybody even knew who I was, you always did, and it was always fun to talk to you.
Well, we all really appreciated what you were doing up there. All us guys from down here, no doubt about it. So, yep. Tip of our hat to you, Jim. Thank you for keeping steer roping in the forefront up there. We appreciate it.
Well, it's on its own now, and it really has done well. It doesn't need me anymore. Coy Thompson, Ted Thompson, all of those Thompsons, Thompson Livestock, they've made sure that steer roping has stayed going. And we should have had it in North Dakota. We had it started in Dickinson for a couple of years, and we had a kind of a battle between two committee men. It didn't have anything to do with the tripping. It was just two committee men. One wanted to be the chairman, and the other wanted to be the chairman, and one wanted the steer roping, and the other didn't. So when the one guy won, he said no steer roping, and that was just more of a spite thing. That's sad. Otherwise, we'd have had that in North Dakota too.
If we got any rodeo committees on here, you guys should really think about adding steer roping, because it does. We do carry the vote for the rodeos of the year. We just got last year Claremore. The last few years, steer ropers have really carried that rodeo and got it I think the medium rodeo of the year, something like that. And they've done the same thing for Deadwood, and they've done the same thing for Cheyenne, and they've done the same thing for Pendleton. There's a bunch of these little. There was a little rodeo named Hartner, Kansas, one time, won small rodeo of the year, and they added steer roping, and steer roping did carry the boat on that. So
you bet.
And
I know that
if you want your
steer roping.
I'm sorry.
The thing that I like in Bighorn, Wyoming, they do the Don King days. The only thing I wish they would do is put together a PRCA deal, but they want it only to be Wyoming guys. Although Guy Allen came up and roped one time, I think Jim Davis went up and roped. Several of the guys have, but you got to rope in so many of their steer ropings in order to get to their finals.
They make it pretty tough on a guy that don't live up there to make the adequate and ropings to get to the Bighorn Don King days over there at Bighorn. Trust me, there's a lot of guys from down here that want to rope in it, and because it's such a fun sounding roping. What is the format of that roping? We talked about it the other day with Glenn Barlow, but I don't know if he explained it where everyone kind of really understood it, Jim.
Well, it depends on the cattle, and they usually have 35 ropers, sometimes 25, but as many as 2 to 3 dozen guys that rope in all the rodeos and qualify to come to Bighorn, and then they rope 2 on Saturday or 2 on Sunday and 2 on Monday of Labor Day weekend. So it's a 4-header. There's no finals; it's just 4-head, but they're roping on the grass, and that makes a big difference. You know, as an announcer, I can tell you that grass those steers sometimes will just pop right back up. They don't stay down. Seen a lot of money were lost. Steer roper can't.
Don't people just park around the arena to make the fence part of it?
Yeah, there's no fence. It just and of course, now that I've seen steer roping enough, I understand why those steer ropers. The steers don't run off to down up the mountain and over the valley. I mean, they get done and run out to the outfield somewhere, and that's where they hold them. But when somebody told me we don't even have fences, the only problem with that is with the people sitting around sometimes just in lawn chairs, a steer might go, might in kind of being a panic, they might run through the crowd, and I've seen that happen a time or two. But those steers aren't going to hurt anybody. There's always somebody there that'll help grab a horn and turn them back. But they do bronc riding too, and they've got the old 10 seconds in the saddle. You got to ride a 10-second bronc, and those horses have bucked through the crowd a couple of times. That's amazing.
Let's stomp down some lawn chairs.
Well, I guess it used to be 10 seconds. I guess when bronc riding first started, they rode them till they quit bucking, and then they moved to a 10-second, and then they moved to an 8-second. And word on the street, they're going to move it down to 6 seconds, Jim.
Yeah.
6 second rides.
It's a little like when I first started doing steer roping. It was always let's see, how did they say that? 2 loops and one flat fall.
2 loops, 2 attempts.
2 attempts and 2 flat falls. You could get there, but then there was some where you could use 2 loops. But most of the guys learned eventually when they got that. When they quit doing that was when the times became so fast. There's no sense. You weren't going to get anything on 2 loops anyway, so they quit it. But that all has changed as we've gone along.
Cheyenne used to be 2 attempts not that long ago. Yeah. I think maybe in the late 80s.
When I was a kid, they called it 2 flat falls. You got 2 flat falls, 2 loops.
A lot of these bigger ropings to this day, I think that I'm not sure if there's any 2 loop ropings left, but definitely usually not 2 flat falls, but 2 attempts, 1 flat fall. That's about the most you'll get nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
That's about the most you'll
get.
Jim,
what's the craziest thing you ever saw while you were announcing a rodeo?
Well, in the steer roping, there's a man named A.B. Cox that ropes out of Nebraska. A.B.'s a cattleman, and he's a steer roper, not bad, but he's a guy that under normal circumstances isn't going to chase you very much if you're a good roper. So they were doing the Hyde Merit Memorial, they call it, up in Laramie, and I announced that for all of the years, I guess. And they had a huge Calcutta. So one day I'm helping with the Calcutta. I'm taking bids, and they're selling the ropers, and they said it was a 6-header. so they said they sold for ones on Saturday, half of them on Saturday, and then a second group on Sunday. Well, somebody brought up A.B. Cox, and I was standing right in front of him, and nobody was going to bid on him. I mean, it was just, and I thought he was my friend, and I felt so bad. So I bid $100, but that, of course, was times 3. So now I owe $300, and I think I'm a young announcer. I don't have that much money, but I'll make it work. I'll make it work. Well, so the third steer, A.B. roped 2, didn't place either time, but he had 2 down, and there weren't very many that did. And his third steer, he was one of the last ropers because he had caught 2 already, and so he was one of the last ropers. He roped the steer, got off his horse, and caught a spur in the saddle. Falls flat on his face. Then he rolls, and it's muddy, and he rolls around in the mud, and he's trying to get up, and the steer is, and I'm looking at the steer right down in front of me, and the steer just watching, not doing it. And I just said, Lord, don't let that steer get up. And the AB comes out of the mud, runs to the steer, ties him up, and they didn't have a time. It was probably 35 seconds. I don't know. It doesn't matter. He didn't place in that round, but he had the only one that caught 3. For my $300, I won like $5,300 in the Calcutta.
Wow.
It's always amazing. And that's only because he's my friend. I got to buy him. I can't leave him. I can't make him feel like nobody wants him.
Well, you did a good deed, and you got rewarded for it. So good deal. Everybody's happy.
And there's all kinds of things that happen in the steer roping or in the other events. I've seen a bull rider killed at the National High School Finals, and there's just there's some sad things, and then there's some funny things. It's rodeo. If you go to enough of them, and I used to do 45, 50 rodeos a year, I'd be all the time for many years. You're bound to run into something funny, but for the most part, the reason most of us do it is because of our friends. Eventually you quit because of the travel, but you hate to quit because of your friends. And that's the thing with the steer ropers. I could walk into any town that had steer roping, and I would know most of those ropers. I got to do Claremore one time. Went up there just to watch the steer roping, and one of the secretary knew me. He said, "Jim, would you announce?" I said, "Shoot, I'm wearing a baseball cap. It doesn't matter. This is slack." I said, "Okay." So I go up and I get to announce Claremore. I mean, to me, that was a real big deal.
Me and Jimbo announced Claremore last year, and then me and for some reason they wanted us to come back this year. I couldn't talk Jimbo into going with me, but I went back and announced Claremore this year.
The slack.
You'd be a natural. You'd be a natural.
He is. He's missed his calling, I think.
Yeah, I think someone was trying to get me to do radio the other day, Jimbo. They said, "Cody, you have a face for radio." Is what they kept telling me. So
yeah,
I'm taking it as a compliment.
That's a compliment. Sure it is. Sure it is.
Cody was clean shaven and a young man when I first met him, and now I see him in that buffalo coat and all those whiskers, and I think I used to know him when he's a young man.
Yeah, who is that guy?
I'm an old hippie and I don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah, right.
This all just came along just out of boredom, and now it's almost part of our trademarks around here.
Yeah, you can't get rid of it now. Nobody know you.
I've been threatening about cutting it all off, though. I did run down the rope, and my nephew's tying steers, and I thought I was going to go down the rope and show him how it's done the other day, Jim, and I got my hair tangled up in my picking string. So,
oh my gosh,
we're going to have to look at that.
Ponytail, you just need a ponytail, rubber band.
Shoot, I'm not tough enough to wear a ponytail around, Jimbo.
Well, just while you're tying steers, shake it out when you get done.
You got to be an awful good roper roping a ponytail. That's all I'm going to say.
Jim, I read some
Rocker Steiner. With his hair as long as it is, I sometimes wonder how come he keeps out of fights, but I guess he doesn't now that I think about it.
Yeah, he doesn't all the time. I don't think.
He seems like a good kid. His dad was a notorious fighter in the PRCA back in his traveling days. Sid Steiner, not even Sid. I ain't picking a fight with you. I'm just giving you your props. Mm-hmm. He definitely, I think, he went looking for some fights back in the day to prove he was the toughest guy around. So I didn't want to mess with him.
Well, my cousin Frank Thompson, I'm trying to think. He won the world in 2000. I think, did Sid win it in 2001? Maybe
something like that.
It was he was, and so I think Sid used Frank's horse. He had a horse that took him to the finals when he won the finals, and then Sid was the second year. So I got to know, but not a lot of the guys didn't care for Sid because, he was different, but Frank thought he was an honest traveler. And that, you can obviously tell. You hear this from many guys. It's not so much how they act in the rodeo arena, it's how they work in the pickup. And, the guys, they take care of you when you're traveling with them. There's a lot of good people learned that way.
Didn't know Frank was your cousin.
Yeah, Frank's my cousin. His dad and my dad were brothers.
I think I read an article about him one time after he won the world. They said the year before he won the world, he was, I think he missed the finals or something. He was having to roof houses. And that sure did make him bulldog a lot better because he didn't want to go back to that.
Oh, that's a hot job.
I one year when he was like 16th, he lost. I was announcing Moses Lake, Washington, and Frank came in, and he bulldogged in the slack to win the rodeo. I mean, he was leading when they went to the last performance, and one guy tied him, and the next guy beat them both. So Frank tied for second instead of winning outright, and the difference between tied for second and winning first was the amount that he lost by the finals. That was the year before he went to the finals. Mm. So he was good at it for a long time, but Paul Tierney said he worked with Paul a long time, and Paul Tierney said he wasn't mean enough to be a world champion. And
I don't know. I worked with him. He's the arena director at Cheyenne now, I think, or he was last time I was there. Yeah. He's definitely got a little meaner since then. If you're jacking around in that arena,
had to get mean.
Do it. Yeah, he had to get mean with me. I was probably doing something he didn't care for that day, Jimbo.
Right. His dad helped us put on the steer roping in Buffalo, South Dakota. He was the banker that ran the bank, and I went to him and Uncle Dennis, would you put up the prize money for this deal? And he did, and Ralph and I added quite a bit. It was the only thing that Wyoming steer roping had added money was in Buffalo that year. In fact, every year we did it, we added money, and that counted. We do it on the Saturday before Don King Day, so we drew good crowds, and Buffalo filled up, so that was nice.
Shoot, yeah. I read somewhere, Jim, that you had another love besides rodeo, and that was baseball. And
I love baseball. Yeah.
They said you came within a whisker of being the play-by-play man for the Minnesota Twins.
I'm pleased that you knew that, but yes, I had a chance, and I don't remember the year, but I was managing the radio station in Watertown, South Dakota, and announced the rodeo, or the baseball paper, like the Rodeo Sports News, the Baseball Bible, came up with a story that the announcer was leaving the Twins, and so they gave the name of the radio station, WCCO, and the program director was Byron Napier. And if anybody's interested, send a tape to By Napier and WCCO. So I didn't have a tape. We didn't tape anything. I mean, everything was live. I took a New York Yankee Minnesota Twins scorecard, and I walked in the studio and I just recorded about 3 innings of baseball. Just did it on the microphone,
right,
and sent them that tape. And they had 33 announcers, and when they came down to the final 3, and they picked me, but the exception, they called me to say, you are our choice to be the Twins announcer. But we have the difference this year is the owner of the Twins has the final say, and he has a former player that's living in Phoenix that's on some hard times, and he'd like to go down and talk to him. And if he wants to come back, we'll have to use him. And that was the case. Frank Quillisi was his name, and he became the announcer. But the Twins called me and said, we're going to keep your thing on file here, and if we need an announcer, we'll call you, or if somebody else calls, we'll get in touch with you and put you in touch with what other team. So I was the Twins announcer for about 15 minutes. And then later, maybe 3 years later, I got a call from the Texas Rangers. And if they had said, we're offering you the job, I'd have taken that. I wouldn't have missed it. But They said, we'd like to have you come down and try out. And at that time I was starting to announce rodeos, and I knew rodeo was never going to be as big a deal as baseball probably, but I liked the lifestyle. I loved the people, and I could manage radio stations and still announce rodeos. And so that's what I did. But I did have a chance, and thank you for even knowing that. That's kind of cool.
Well, I told you we've got a mutual friend in Doc Ford up there in Lemon.
He's a champion.
Yeah, he's a good one. Still working, over 80 years, 82 years old or something, and still gets out there and preg tests those cows and stuff, just puts in a heck of a day.
He's amazing.
Yeah, he put me to shame.
When we put on the very first year that he started to steer rope, at least officially steer rope, he came to Buffalo, and the very first steer that he roped, that was the first one he'd ever caught and got him on the ground. And it took him forever. I mean, we didn't have a time limit, but he placed because nobody else caught. So I think he was third in that round, and he was so proud. He said, "Jim, I wish you gave buckles for this." I almost went out and got a buckle for him just for that. But Doc Ford he is a well-respected gentleman in Lemon, South Dakota. And if you ever get a chance to be in his house, he is a collector. My goodness, the Western memorabilia. It's just fun to be and a real gentleman.
Yeah, he sure is. And he just loves the old rodeo, the old steer roping, Western movies. He's Custer's Last Stand. I mean, he's just pretty well versed on any of that, and he just loves the old history. I really enjoy talking to him. But
you guys
go ahead.
You've been talking to me for over an hour, and I don't know how much of this you can use, but I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, we use it all.
Well, it's all going in, Jim.
Yeah, it's all going. If you were starting a Mount Rushmore, Jim, of rodeo announcers, who would you put on it? Need 4 names.
Oh, Clem McSpadden, obviously. I think Clem was one of the very best. In fact, I'd probably say he was the best. He started after me, but not by much. Bob Tallman I'd be foolish to not include Bob Tallman. Bob is his personality makes him in one moment in a rodeo he can be the very best, and the next he can be the dumbest. His mouth isn't ruled much. But Bob is his success. Everything he's done. We talk on the phone often because he's a man I admire. So I'd certainly put him in there. And the guy that used to do, you're putting my memory at risk here just a little bit. And there's some good announcers out there today. The only problem I have, Jimbo, is with announcers today. Everybody they learned how to scream somehow. And I often will say that, you don't have to scream it. If the crowd knows a 65-point ride, you don't scream over a 65-point ride or a 15-second calf rope and run. But when that horse works and the roper is down the line and it's going to be in the sixes, then you're going to yell. And when Billy Etbauer is on one and he's riding a horse that's never been ridden and he's going to spur one for 90 points. I mean, you can yell at it then. And I always use baseball as the analogy. And I say, in baseball, when there's a ground ball to short, the shortstop picks it up behind second, throws to first, there's one out. You don't scream for that. Mm-hmm. But when somebody hits it off the base of the wall in center field, it bounces back past the center fielder, it's coming back toward the infield. The guy is rounding second. He's going to come back to third, and he's safe at third. I mean, then that's right. When your voice gets, and right. That's when because that's what makes the crowd excited. They can tell by what you're doing how good that run or that ride is. And I think I get so tired, and music has changed rodeo. I don't know that it's for the best. Right. Clowns having microphones have changed announcers, because whether a committee knows it or not, that clown becomes a second announcer or a third. And the announcer, in my case, I'd been given this task of making sure all the sponsors are mentioned and making sure that all the information about what's going on at the rodeo is there. But the clown doesn't have any of that. All he's doing is telling jokes. And that changes the announcer. Instead of being able to work him in when you can, you've got to work around him. And that's been difficult. And another thing for me, the thing that made it difficult for announcers, I always was pretty good with math. And Cody, I don't know if you ever noticed, but I mean, I can add those numbers faster than somebody with a calculator. I don't need to know a 9.8 and a 9.3 is a 19.1. I mean, that's you just know it. And somebody's over there trying to put it into a computer, and then when they put up the boards, they've got the computer boards, and that's on there automatically. That takes away somebody like me that knows how to do that. You kind of lose it a little bit. So that's I got into that story a little bit, but nonetheless, that's kind of what helped me not want to be an announcer anymore. But like Clem McSpadden, Bob Tallman, those guys, they didn't have those advantages either.
Right.
And they're the ones that are good at it. And I'm sure there's some other
Hadley
other
Barrett,
names.
that was a good announcer.
Say that again?
I sure thought Hadley Barrett was a good announcer.
Oh, Hadley. Yeah, Hadley, I shouldn't have forgotten Hadley. I enjoy Hadley. He didn't scream. He was pretty, and Randy Corley, of course. Randy's probably one of my best friends, and so Randy's the kind of a guy. I know one time one of the committee men in Deadwood had talked to Randy, and this was a new committee man, and so I had done Deadwood for 30 years, and they asked Randy if he would want to come to Deadwood. And Randy called me and said, "Jim, I thought you did Deadwood." I said, "I do." Well, somebody brought it up to me. I'm not gonna take that if you're still doing it. And that was Randy. It's a real gentleman, and I do the same thing.
Right.
Somebody called. I'd want to make sure I'm not taking a job from somebody because, frankly, it doesn't pay that well. So why would you work something
Right.
against a friend?
Yeah. I agree.
I like Justin McKee. I think he's a great announcer.
Yeah.
He does get to screaming sometimes and yelling, but I kind of like it sometimes.
We like
Yeah.
Justin
It gets
around
me off.
here for sure.
He gets me all.
You want to hear my story about Justin McKee?
Yeah.
Sure.
I was doing the NARC finals in El Paso, and the PRCA blending into that is for another day. But I was doing that was the amateur finals at the NARC finals, North American Rodeo Commission. It was in El Paso. I get down there, and here's this young man, fresh-faced from Kansas, Justin McKee, and he wants to be an announcer, and would he mind if he watched me? I said, "No, I don't mind. You can watch me." As a matter of fact, I said, "There's a lot of slack. You're welcome to do some of the slack, and I can listen to you and give you some feedback." Okay, he said, "That'd be fine." Well, later in the week, a group from New York came down, and they wanted to tape and put on TV the finals of the North American Rodeo Commission World Finals. So, Jim Thompson, would you announce the TV finals? Well, they wanted to do it live. I've many times announced over a tape and still did the finals without any trouble. But this case, they wanted to announce it as it happened and tape it and then play it. But I'd need to be down in the broadcast booth taping this finals and they needed another announcer. And I said, "Well, then we need Justin McKee is here. Why not use him?" So Justin announced the finals of the North American Rodeo Commission World Finals. And then, of course, later Justin, got into the PBR and all of that stuff and TV. And so things have gone well. One day he happened to be out in Spearfish when I was living in Spearfish, where my studio was. And they asked me if I wouldn't mind going to dinner with him and talk to Justin. I said, "Sure, I'd be glad to see Justin." So when I got there, he said, "You're responsible for my not getting a degree from the University of Kansas or Kansas State." I don't know which one, but I said, "Why am I responsible?" Because he said, "I was supposed to go back from El Paso to take my finals, but you got me into doing the rodeo finals, and as a result, I missed my finals and didn't graduate." I thought that's a good story. Justin, I like Justin. Yeah, he's a fine guy.
Yeah, he's about as good as they come.
Yep.
We like him pretty well.
Sure.
Just like you, Jim.
Yep.
We think you're a hell of a guy, too.
Yep.
Well, that's high honors for me, Cody. Thank you.
Hey, one
we're
time
still
Jim put
watching.
on this party at Deadwood Jimbo, and he only invited all his steer roper buddies and his other buddies. I probably shouldn't be telling this, but I'm going to. Well, I started gambling and gambling and gambling and gambling. Well, I had to go write a check to the rodeo secretary the next morning just to get out of town.
You don't have much of a governor when you start gambling, do you? I've heard those stories before.
No, not up there. Not at that particular time.
I heard a Las Vegas story, too, about you one time.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, I didn't think about you have to pay to park in the parking lot at the airport. I didn't
allow for that, did you?
I didn't allow for that when I left, so.
Oh, yeah.
I had to write them a check, too, that night.
What I do is take a $20 bill and put it in the overhead on my car. So if I forget that I don't have any cash when I get to the airport, I can at least get out of the parking lot.
yeah, I couldn't. It was a bad situation that day, but that's all right. I learned a good lesson from it, Jimbo.
Part of living, growing up, isn't it?
I learned a real good lesson from it. Keep a 20 in your sock.
Yep.
Keep a 20 in your sock.
Smart.
Jim, we sure appreciate you coming on the show today, and we may have to do another one with you when some stuff goes down up there.
A lot of my stories are, I don't even think about them until we're talking, but it's fun. There's a lot of, like the Justin McKee story. That's a good story. To me, that makes me feel good about a young man that I had a part in his life, and it makes you feel good. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah. No problem. You're responsible for the voice of the Western way of life right now, old Justin.
Yeah.
This other guy coming up he don't seem to yell too much, just seems to stay a good, classy, just calling the rodeo as he sees it, is old Garrett Yerrigan. He's doing Cheyenne now. I think he won Announcer of the Year last year.
Yeah, I've never heard him, but I've heard about him. So
I watched Cheyenne, and he was just smooth and steady, just like a freight train, and he really brought an old school feel back to it, really. From what I saw and listened to, so he's doing a very good job.
When the clown's not talking, he's doing pretty good.
Well, I don't mind the clown talking. I'm a big fan of the clown over here.
I'm with Jim on them clowns talking.
Well, they used to actually relay from the arena up to the announcer, and then the announcer would say what the clown was saying. Then the announcer would go back and a little banter like that. But it doesn't bother me. I like the clowns, so.
I do too.
I wanted to be a rodeo clown, Jimbo. So
right, I know
it did change. It did change for the announcer though when the clowns got a mic, because that they don't have to ask. They don't have to holler up at you anymore. They just talk.
It is a little daunting task. Jimbo didn't go with me to Claremore, so the very first round, Scott Grover and I did together. Yeah, and they had the sound guy. He was playing music and everything for the first go round, and then the second go round, it was just me, no sound, no Scott Grover, just me and the secretaries up there, and my sheet didn't even have their hometowns on it. So luckily, it was steer roping, and I knew 80% of the hometowns, but there's some guys coming up that I've never even seen rope before, right. And there's some tough dudes.
Yep.
Well, and it's really getting into the all around. The guys are seeing now that if they can do well in the steer roping, that can get them into the all-around standings. And if they can excel, that's good. So that brings a lot of young guys out of college, which might not have been in steer roping, although steer roping in college has started. And I always send them a check at the end, for that deal. I think that's good.
Yeah, I'm on their text message thread where they do send out for a donation, and next time they send me one, I'm definitely going to send some money back from the museum here. We need to support that, no doubt.
You bet.
Yep. But it is good to see some names you never seen rope before, and some of the bigger team ropers. They're kind of getting into it, which is kind of good to watch. Kind of comical because they can out rope just about everybody, but they can't control every little thing that happens in a steer roping run, and it really drives some of these big name team ropers nuts. They can do everything so perfect, and it still not work out for them. I've seen JoJo Lamont, one of the best ropers I think ever, quit steer roping 2 or 3 times just out of aggravation. So
yes, I know JoJo, and I know that can happen. Yeah,
yep,
he's a good kid.
Many intangibles can happen in this sport of steer roping. Just a lot more things can go wrong. And it really does drive some of these guys nuts because they do everything perfect the way they were taught and the way and they just can't get anything done sometimes. So it's fun to watch.
Fun to watch.
Jim,
I love the steer roping.
We could probably go on for hours and hours today.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we could. And I appreciate it. Thank you. You've just made my day today. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to tell you thank you for everything that you've done for our sport up in the Dakotas and Wyoming, and you've done a lot. You've done a heck of a lot, and a lot of these ropings have stuck around, and they're year in, year out roping, and I know all the ropers look forward to going to them, and I know all the roping fans up there look forward to seeing them all come, and it's just
yes, that's made a big difference.
It's a good thing that you're doing up there, and we appreciate it from all the guys down here.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, and Jimbo especially. I get to listen to you now. I get to talk to you. That's great. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I've heard a lot of good things about you, and I really enjoyed it, Jim.
I'll make sure when I like to be at Cody's auctions too when I've gone down there, so that's always good. My son lives in Tulsa, and so I've usually gone down over Father's Day to spend time with him, and then I go first and help Rod with his roping, but then I've had a couple of, about the last 3 years, there have been issues. I just couldn't get down there for Father's Day. So I don't know when, but we'll get there. I want to see you. I want to go back to your store.
He was down here about, I don't know, I'm going to say it's about 10 years ago. And he saw, they didn't have an auctioneer show up for the Calcutta at the Ben Johnson. So I just stepped in and did it. And that was my first auctioneer gig ever. And he thought I'd been doing it for a long time, Jimbo.
Yeah, you're a natural.
Well, I think he just gave me some he kind of gave me a pat on the back, told me how good I did. I maybe didn't do that
Maybe
good,
you didn't do
whatever.
that good.
Jim, thanks for coming on. Thanks for everybody for listening, and we'll see y'all next week. Appreciate it.
See you down the road. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
See you down the road. That's right. Yeah. Was that your tagline when you were a radio host?
That's the way you do it.
That's right. I like it.
God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. We sure appreciate you, man.
See you guys.
Bye.